What's up guys, DRJ here, and today I want to talk to you guys about BF3. It seems a little silly to do this because the demo is actually coming out in a few days, but I want to do this chat for a while. There's a few different key mechanics that are happening in Battlefield 3 that started happening in this series essentially after Battlefield Vietnam came out. And I want to talk about the possible impact that those are going to have on the game as far as I see it from someone who played a metric shit ton of Battlefield 1942 and Battlefield Vietnam. I want to talk about that briefly. I did introduce this stuff in I think the earliest Down the Rabbit Hole series, but I'll recap it again for anybody who missed those. So essentially the gist of my competitive gaming experience came from the Battlefield series. So started off essentially Battlefield 1942. It was one of the first games I even played on computer, and started off, loved the game, had a blast with it. You know, it was the first Conquest style video game that came out. That is what made the Battlefield series so different. Conquest style gameplay, you move around, you capture basically, what do you call it, you capture the neutral flags that are around the map, and then from there you have tickets. Each side has a ticket, say whatever, 200 tickets, and when one team controls the majority of those tickets, you start getting ticket bleed on the other side, and you also lose a ticket every time someone on your team dies. So whoever reaches 0 first, of course, loses. In addition to having Conquest style gameplay, Battlefield series brought in something else, which is essentially the combination of vehicles. Like had tanks, jeeps, what do they add? Artillery, and then planes, of course. And there are actually even a few maps with naval destroyers and submarines and things like that. They really weren't that. They were not a whole lot of fun, and they weren't heavily used. But essentially the combination of planes, tanks, jeeps, and it was actually meshed really well into the infantry combat as well. With Conquest, it gave essentially FPS gaming. It brought in this new layer of depth, of tactical decision making, as opposed to just your straight up TDM style FPS games that you'd seen up until then. When you're thinking of TDM style games, you can basically think of Quake, which really popularized that genre, beat it to death, and essentially led to something like Battlefield coming out. Battlefield Vietnam came out after Battlefield 42, and what Battlefield Vietnam did really well is it kept all that Conquest style gameplay, and it actually brought in helicopters, did those extremely well. One of the things that I was very disappointed to see when playing Bad Company 2 for the first time was how the helicopters had been essentially neutered. You have things like the auto horizon axis, where it makes it very difficult to circle strafe, number one, but number two, it took all the fun and definitely it took all the skill out of flying the helicopter. There's no more momentum in the helicopter, so it essentially flies itself. Anybody can fly it, but it's also really frustrating because you may want to go backwards or forwards or to the side, and it's not easy because of that auto horizon line that essentially, the helicopter just feels like it's flying itself. Very frustrating. So some of the things that are coming out with the Battlefield 3 game, that I'm a little bit worried about. It started off with essentially EA calling out Activision, saying that they had their number, they got their ticket, etc., and their whatever game is done for. I was a little worried about this because I was wondering if they had started picking up on the whole idea of COD selling so well as a result of essentially making the game more accessible, dumbing it down so that there's not this huge skill gap between the very good and the very bad, and anybody can be good on any given day. So I'd sort of wondered about that from the very beginning. That leads into basically the two biggest things that I'm concerned about are essentially the spawning system and the map size. So Battlefield 42 and Battlefield Vietnam, I believe, but definitely 42, were actually marketed towards the 64-player crowd, but they were definitely designed for maybe 12 players at most in a server on any given map at a time. Obviously there's a little bit of variance there, but for the most part, 10v10, 12v12 was the optimal game setting. Whether or not you like to play with more or less people is obviously individual preference to an extent, but like when you look at, say, a map layout, and you have 4 tanks and 2 planes and a jeep, chances are that map probably wasn't designed for 64 players. It was designed for 10v10, 12v12, and especially when you play that map on 32v32, what ends up happening is you have 15 guys on the runway, another 5 guys camping for tanks, and at any given point, that point is won or lost simply by which way the Zerg swarm decides to go. It's infuriating. There's absolutely zero skill involved whatsoever, and it really, really bummed me out to hear that they were promoting the game once again as a 64-player game. But I'm really skeptical given the history of the Battlefield series and knowing that it did happen in the past where they marketed that at 64 players, but what it was designed for 12. One of the reasons why it's probably bullshit once again is because if you design a map for 64 players, unless you have a dynamic map that's changing based on the amount of players that are in that game or based on those server settings, you can't design a map for 64 players because it would feel so big and so empty if you didn't have those 64 players in the game at any given time. So that's why you design a game essentially for, what, 10v10, 15v15, and then market it towards 64v64, and, you know, basically betting on that at, you know, half the time it'll be somewhere around that number that you are marketing it for. But anyway, like I said, that's large player size, one of the great ways to make a game more accessible, market it towards a bigger audience, but unfortunately means bigger sales, but on the downside it means that that skill gap or the difference between the very good and the very bad is going to be very, very minimal. One of the other big issues I'm worried about is the spotting system. So to sort of contrast this with the way they used to do it, with the way they do it now, it's I'd love to know. I'd love to be at that dev table to hear what their thoughts are. So the way they did it in 42 was really interesting. They actually technically had a spotting system, but until a few days ago when I was thinking about it, I didn't even realize that they did have a spotting system. I didn't even know it was in there. So what happened is if I saw an enemy, I could say I spotted an infantry, I could say I spotted a tank, artillery, plane, jeep, whatever. And what would happen is on my map, I would start highlighting, and anyone who was on my team would see my cursor on their map essentially blinking yellow or red or what the fuck ever, it doesn't matter. At no point on either Battlefield Vietnam or Battlefield 1942 did the enemy players ever pop up on radar. That was never, ever, ever there. That's one of the dangers. I mean, I don't even know if I have to explain this. I mean, when you spot somebody and you point them out for everybody on your team to see, and granted, I know that they've undergone a lot of different changes in the Battlefield 3 spotting system. You know, it works differently for infantry as opposed to tanks or vehicles. I think the tanks and the vehicles actually get a big fucking red Dorito spotting over them that you can see on the map itself and on the mini-map, and the infantry just show up on the mini-map or something like that, and then it's broken once they hit cover. But in my opinion, the spotting system, anything to do with radar in general, is a massive skill equalizing factor. And that taken in addition with the already supposedly large player sizes on PC, very, very frustrating. One of the other downsides, of course, to PC gaming, as always, is you're getting the hardcore settings and the other variability settings, especially with the different player sizes on the different servers for the different modes. So what's going to happen is you boot up your PC on day one, and you're going to see whatever Wake Island take, for example. You're going to have that map played on, what, I think they have 5 different game modes, and you're going to have servers that have one of 3 different maximum player settings, and on top of that, then you have several hardcore, and I think there's 3 different settings to play hardcore, and then 2 others, I don't know what they were. So there's so much variability that, especially as someone who enjoys trying to prove that he, you know, is one of the best players out there, how do you do that when every single server you go into is different? I mean, being the best doesn't mean jack shit if you can't find this constant sort of constant server or constant game type to be going up against. I mean, not only are there like 5 game modes, but there's multiple, like I said, player sizes, and on top of that you have different server settings to modify even those. So a little frustrating, definitely skeptical about it. What is today? Tuesday. I think I pre-ordered it, so I get to load up the demo tomorrow and let you guys know my first thoughts after playing that for a few days. Otherwise, as usual, let me know questions, comments, criticism, and stay tuned for more.